There comes a moment in every man's life when the world goes silent, not because he has found peace, but because he has lost everything that made noise. The friends fall away, the titles fade, the mirrors no longer flatter. In that silence, where the applause has stopped and the masks no longer fit, he is left with a single undeniable presence: God. And in that sacred aloneness, the real journey begins. Not upward, but inward. When a man finds himself alone, stripped of companionship, distractions, and worldly validation, he is driven inward by necessity. The outer world becomes a barren landscape, a place where once there was engagement and meaning, now only echoes remain. And so, without even intending to, the man begins a descent into the inner world. This is not a conscious choice. It is often triggered by crisis, abandonment, failure, or grief, situations that violently sever his ties to the collective, to the social structures that gave him identity. With nothing left to hold on to, he must face what lies within. And here begins the confrontation with the self. The self, not to be confused with the ego, is a vast totality encompassing both the conscious and unconscious aspects of one's being. It holds the light and the shadow, the potential and the repressed. The ego, which once proudly constructed the man's life through ambition, persona, and control, is now impotent. It cannot negotiate with loneliness. It cannot explain away pain. It cannot distract from the quiet terror of meaninglessness. In this space of psychological nakedness, the self begins to stir. What arises first is often fear, not the fear of external threat, but the fear of what lies dormant within. Dreams become vivid, often unsettling. Symbols appear, thoughts deepen, strange longings emerge. These are not random. They are messages from the unconscious, from the parts of the psyche the man had no time or courage to engage while he was busy living for others. When he had friends, lovers, duties, and desires, the unconscious could be ignored. But now, in solitude, it rises like floodwater. It forces him to confront truths about himself he long denied. He sees not only his wounds, but his complicity in them. He meets not only the pain others gave him, but the pain he gave to others. Rage he buried in politeness now seethes at the surface. Shame he cloaked in success now bleeds through the cracks of memory. But alongside the torment is also something strangely sacred, the presence of unclaimed potential, forgotten dreams, and the haunting voice of conscience. All these elements are facets of the self. They are not external enemies, they are exiled parts of his own soul. In confronting these inner figures, the man begins the journey of integration. He starts to realize that the only path forward is not to escape these elements, but to engage with them, to listen to their story, to understand their roots, to accept them as part of his truth. And in this deepening dialogue with the self, he undergoes transformation. The isolation that once felt like punishment begins to reveal its secret purpose, to draw him back to wholeness, not through external relationships, but through internal reconciliation. This confrontation with the self is no romantic quest. It is raw, difficult, and often prolonged. There is resistance at every step. The ego fights for its old illusions, craving the comfort of the known. But the longer he walks this inner path, the more he sees that what he feared was not death, but rebirth. And in this alchemical process, where suffering becomes the fire of purification, he begins to glimpse something eternal within himself, something he had always sensed, but never dared to face fully until now. When a man is left with no one but God, the idea of the divine begins to change. It no longer comes from a sermon, a sacred book, or the lips of others. In solitude, all borrowed images fade. The God that once belonged to tradition or childhood becomes irrelevant. unable to satisfy the depth of the man's existential hunger. What arises instead is a more primordial experience, one that emerges not from instruction, but from the unconscious itself. In the stillness of being alone, the mind begins to shift from outer recognition to inner awareness. Symbols, once read in scripture or seen in temples, begin to appear in dreams, in thoughts, in sudden intuitions, not because the man seeks them, but because something deeper is speaking to him from within. This is the point at which the archetype of the divine begins to take form. It is not a god of dogma, not a figure crafted by institutions, but an image that arises spontaneously from the psyche. Across cultures and time, human beings have shared recurring images of divinity, not by coincidence, but because these archetypes lie buried in the collective unconscious. The wise old man, the all-seeing eye, the flame, the child, the mountain, the tree of life. These symbols are ancient expressions of something vast and unknowable. When a man is cut off from the world and stripped of illusions, these images begin to surface, not as myths, but as personal experiences. They carry an emotional weight, a numinous quality that speaks not to belief, but to recognition. The man begins to understand that God is not found, but revealed, not through external instruction, but inner awakening. The process is not gentle. These archetypal experiences can overwhelm the conscious mind. The ego, which once dictated the terms of spiritual engagement, finds itself silenced. The man may experience a profound sense of awe, even terror. He may feel watched, called, or tested. The presence of the divine does not necessarily bring comfort, it brings reality. And reality, when seen without filters, can be destabilizing. Yet, within this experience lies the seed of transformation. The man begins to see that God is not merely a protector or a father figure. God becomes a force of truth, a mirror that reveals the totality of who he is, not just what he wants to be. In the sacred texts of many traditions, prophets and mystics undergo solitary encounters with the divine. They retreat to deserts, mountaintops, or caves. But these locations are not only physical, they represent psychological states of emptiness and surrender. When a man has no one left but God, he enters his own inner cave. In that darkness, he does not hear the voice of a distant being. He hears the echo of his own soul, transfigured into something larger, something infinite. This voice does not command, it questions. It does not flatter, it exposes. And in this sacred exposure, the man realizes that the divine is not outside of him, but imprinted within him. Every symbol, every vision, every moment of deep intuition is a message from this inner source, what ancient mystics called the imago Dei, the image of God within the soul. These revelations come not through effort, but through surrender. The less he clings to concepts, the more space the inner world has to speak. Dreams become teachings, synchronicities guide him. He begins to notice meaning where once there was only chaos. The archetype of the divine, once hidden beneath layers of identity and distraction, now emerges as a guiding force, not because it solves his problems, but because it offers a new perspective, a perspective rooted not in control, but in alignment. In this alignment, the man does not merely worship God. He begins to embody the truth that God has always been part of him, waiting in silence for the moment of awakening. The death of the ego is not a dramatic event witnessed by others, nor is it always recognized when it occurs. It happens in quiet revolutions within a man's soul, often through a series of painful collapses, the loss of identity, of certainty, of control. When a man finds himself with no one but God, all the structures he once leaned on, society, approval, status, even his own carefully curated sense of self, begin to disintegrate. These are not simply external circumstances falling apart. They are mirrors reflecting a deeper dismantling within. The ego, once the master architect of his world, now stares at ruins. The image he held of himself, constructed over years, starts to feel alien. What he used to be no longer makes sense, and what he is becoming cannot yet be named. The ego thrives on distinction. It separates, categorizes, possesses. It says, "This is me and that is not me." It clings to roles, to narratives, to achievements. But solitude, true solitude, strips a man of these illusions. When there is no one to impress, no one to protect or to fight, the ego's script runs out of pages. Its voice becomes desperate, frantic at first, then increasingly faint. In its place comes a deep silence, and that silence is terrifying, not because it is empty, but because it is unfamiliar. The man begins to sense that there is something beyond the ego, something larger, deeper, more whole, but he cannot yet grasp it. He only knows that what he once was no longer holds. This dying is not a single moment. It is a process of surrender. The ego resists at every stage. It bargains, deflects, rebrands its collapse as a new form of pride or spiritual superiority. But God, not as an idea, but as a living reality, does not respond to games. God requires truth, and so the man is invited to descend further into the places the ego most fears: failure, insignificance, vulnerability. These are not punishments. They are the gateways through which the deeper self may emerge. The man learns not through theory but experience, that in losing everything he thought he was, he begins to discover what he truly is. The death of the ego is often accompanied by a great internal darkness. The man feels unseen, unheard, unvalued. He feels erased. And yet, this erasure creates space. Without the constant noise of self-definition, something ancient and wordless begins to stir. The self, the true center of the psyche, does not shout, it waits. It waits for the ego to quiet, for the man to release his grip on control. And when the ego finally bows, not out of wisdom but exhaustion, the self steps forward. It does not replace the ego, but realigns it. The man does not become less himself, he becomes more whole, not by adding, but by shedding. In this state, a paradox emerges. The man who was once so focused on being someone, being strong, successful, righteous, admired, now finds peace in simply being. He no longer needs to define or defend. He moves from will to trust, from force to flow. The ego, now humbled, still exists, but it serves a greater master. The man lives not from fear or ambition, but from something that feels eternal, something that does not fluctuate with praise or blame. What has died was never truly him, only the mask, and what remains is not a new mask, but the face that has always been there, waiting in the silence, waiting for him to return. Individuation is the journey of becoming whole, and it rarely begins in comfort. It is often triggered by a crisis of separation from the world, from others, and ultimately from the self the man thought he was. When a man is left with no one but God, solitude is no longer a condition he can avoid. It becomes the landscape of his transformation. The loneliness that once seemed like a punishment becomes the womb of something profound, the birth of a deeper self. But this birth is not immediate. It unfolds slowly, painfully, and without clear direction. The man is no longer guided by the maps of society. Instead, he is pulled inward, where a different kind of navigation is required, one that trusts symbols, instincts, and moments of silence. In this solitary journey, the man begins to shed the layers that once protected him. These layers are not only social roles, but psychological constructs. The achiever, the helper, the rebel, the thinker. These personas once served a purpose. They allowed him to survive, to belong, to succeed. But in isolation they lose their utility. There is no one left to impress, no structure left to validate them. And so the man is forced to ask, if I am not what I do, not what I own, not what others say about me, then who am I? This question does not lead to immediate answers. It leads deeper into the unknown. As he descends into himself, the man begins to notice the fragments he has ignored. Impulses, emotions, memories, dreams. These pieces are not random. They are aspects of his psyche that have been exiled, often because they did not fit the image he constructed. Anger, fear, sensuality, playfulness, even moments of awe, they all return, asking not to dominate but to be integrated. In solitude, he can no longer suppress them with noise or distraction. He must face them, and in facing them, he begins to understand that wholeness is not the absence of darkness, but the conscious inclusion of it. To individuate is to bring together what was split, to embrace the paradoxes that live within. This process changes how he relates to the divine. God is no longer an external judge or protector. God becomes the great inner witness, the source that calls him to authenticity, not conformity. The man begins to sense that his unique soul has a shape, a rhythm, a language. It does not want to be someone else's idea of good or successful. It wants to be fully itself, with all its complexity. And this realization brings a new kind of peace, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of alignment. Solitude sharpens this realization. Without the noise of others' expectations, the man begins to trust his inner voice. He sees how often he betrayed himself to please others, to avoid rejection, to maintain a facade. Now, in silence, he learns to speak truthfully, even if no one hears. He learns to act from inner necessity, not outer pressure. This is not selfishness. It is responsibility to the self, and in this responsibility lies freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever he wants, but the freedom to become who he truly is. The journey of individuation is never complete. It unfolds throughout life, demanding attention, courage, and humility. But in that unfolding, the man begins to live from depth, not surface. He becomes less reactive, more grounded. He no longer seeks approval because he has found something more enduring than praise. He has found meaning, not a meaning imposed from outside, but a meaning that grows from within, like a tree rooted in sacred soil. This meaning is not grand or loud. It is quiet, steady, and entirely his own. When a man finds himself with no one but God, the silence surrounding him begins to take on a life of its own. At first it may seem unbearable, an endless void pressing inward from all directions. In that silence, he hears echoes he once drowned out with noise, the regrets he never voiced, the pain he never named, the longings he dismissed as foolish. The world he once knew, a world filled with endless dialogue, stimulation, connection, and noise, has receded. In its absence, the silence becomes his only companion. But in this silence lies something more than emptiness. It is alive, it listens, and slowly it begins to speak. The dialogue that unfolds in this stillness is not like any external conversation. It is not fast, it does not flatter, and it offers no quick answers. It speaks in symbols, in moods, in dreams. The man learns to listen with more than his ears. He listens with his whole being. A thought that returns again and again, a line from a book that suddenly stings with personal meaning, a dream that lingers like smoke after waking. These are the language of God in solitude. It is not the language of certainty or command. It is the language of the soul trying to remember itself. This inward conversation is not always comforting. In fact, it often begins with confrontation. The man sees how often he betrayed his inner voice in order to be accepted. He recalls the countless times he felt a quiet warning in his chest and ignored it for the sake of ambition, relationship, or survival. Now that everything else has been stripped away, he begins to recognize that the quiet voice he once dismissed may have been the only truth he ever needed. He understands, perhaps for the first time, that guidance does not always shout. It whispers, and it is in silence that one finally learns to hear it. There is a sacred intimacy in this dialogue. The man no longer petitions God like a distant authority figure. He speaks to God as presence, not above him, but within him. He begins to sense that the line between prayer and thought, between reflection and revelation, has thinned. There are moments when he does not feel like he is talking to God, but being talked through by God. These are not moments of grandeur. They are often humble and subtle, a sudden clarity while washing his hands, an unexpected peace while watching the wind move through trees. These moments do not announce themselves, but they leave a mark. As this relationship deepens, the man becomes more honest, not because he must, but because he cannot bear the falseness that once passed for communication. He confesses without ritual, he thanks without occasion, he questions without fear, and he learns that this honesty is the true form of worship. There are no theatrics here, no need for performance. God does not require performance. God requires truth. The man discovers that he is not praying to change God's mind, but to remember his own soul. And in that remembering, he is remade. Over time, this dialogue becomes the axis of his life. It guides his choices, shapes his perceptions, and offers a kind of companionship deeper than any he has known. The silence that once felt like abandonment now feels like embrace. It holds him, it listens, it answers, not always in words but in synchronicities, in peace, in a sudden shift of understanding. This is no longer a man talking to God. This is a man walking with God. And that walk begins each day in silence, in listening, in trust. When a man has no one but God, the measure of strength shifts. It is no longer the kind of strength that dominates or controls. It becomes the strength to remain standing in the midst of uncertainty, to endure the absence of affirmation, to carry wounds without demanding pity. The strength that arises in divine isolation is not loud. It is quiet, rooted, and almost invisible. It comes not from proving anything to the world, but from surviving the collapse of everything that once defined him. When a man's illusions, relationships, and even identity fall away, he finds himself face to face with an inner reservoir he never knew existed. This is not a strength that can be taught by others. It is born only in trial, in abandonment, in spiritual solitude. The man begins to see that what others called weakness, his sensitivity, his sorrow, his doubt, was never weakness at all. In fact, these were the gateways into depth. The man who has been brought low, who has tasted the bitterness of his own vulnerability, emerges not harder, but softer, and in that softness lies an indestructible strength. He no longer pretends to be invulnerable. He no longer performs the role of the stoic warrior who feels nothing. Instead, he walks with the kind of dignity that does not need to be seen. The strength he now holds is not reactive. It is patient. It does not fear brokenness. It carries it with reverence. He has been broken open, and from within that break, something holy has emerged. The man who stands with only God learns the value of waiting. He no longer rushes to fix, to answer, to fill the silence. He learns to sit in discomfort, to observe his pain without immediately anesthetizing it. This waiting is not passive, it is active endurance. It requires more fortitude than action. He allows the wound to speak, and in doing so discovers that his strength is not in resisting suffering, but in allowing it to change him. The pain no longer defines him, but it informs him. He does not use it as a shield or a weapon, he lets it become wisdom. The endurance that emerges here is not bitter or cynical. It is marked by quiet grace, the kind that neither seeks pity nor demands understanding. Such strength confuses the world. To many, the man may appear defeated or detached, but those who look closely will see a different light in his eyes, not the fire of pride, but the still flame of presence. He does not dominate a room, he grounds it. He does not boast of spiritual insights, he simply embodies them. His words are few but weighty. He knows what matters and what does not. He has learned the art of letting go, not as a strategy, but as a truth. The strength he holds now is not for show, but for carrying what cannot be seen: silence, surrender, love that asks for nothing. In this state, the man becomes a quiet refuge. Others may not understand what changed him, but they will feel it. They will feel safer around him, less judged, more accepted. He does not need to convert or convince. His presence speaks for him. It says, "I have been to the bottom, and I did not find despair. I found God." And this knowing, this unshakable, wordless knowing, is the true strength. It does not depend on circumstances, approval, or success. It comes from alignment with something eternal. It is the strength of one who walks not alone but alongside the divine, in full awareness, in full surrender, in full truth. So, when a man has no one but God, he does not emerge weaker, he becomes whole. Not because he has conquered the world, but because he has surrendered to what lies beneath it. In the death of his ego, he finds his soul. In the silence, he hears truth. In the pain, he uncovers strength. And in walking alone, he discovers that he was never alone at all. The world may never understand such a man, but heaven does, because in his solitude he did not fall apart. He was made sacred.